Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So this week we're going to take a quick look at some of the options that you can find in the background of Squarespace, the templates and so forth that you can use. So you can see when you go to add a page, there are lots of different headings. So you've got a general page, an appointments page, an about page, contact page, etc. And as you can see, as we go through each one, there are multiple different design layouts and templates, all fully already formatted, that you can use. You can, of course, start with a blank page if you want, but all of these are quite useful. And of course, you can very easily modify them, as you've seen in other previous Squarespace videos. But the other backend, well, one of the other backends is the site style. So you can go into the colors. You can see I'm using a grayscale palette here, but they have a set of palettes. You can obviously customize your own, but there's a set of palettes that show multiple different complementary colors if you don't have a sense of color aesthetic, which I pretty much don't. You can control how the animations work on the site as each page loads and how quickly they move. And of course, you can also figure out what kind of default you want for inserting images in those settings. So lots of useful stuff to help you build a good site. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drachinifel. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Now this is going to be a slightly different Friday video in that I'm actually looking at a naval-related computer game. The fine folks who actually developed Rule the Waves 3 were kind enough to give me an advanced copy, and yes, I know it's been out for a little while, but as those of you who follow the channel will know, I've been a little busy, being in Australia and things like that, and I've wanted to get a fair amount of gameplay under my belt as well, so that I could give a full, honest, and at least vaguely coherent review of the game. Aficionados will know that Rule the Waves 1 and Rule the Waves 2, both of which I've played quite extensively, could only be bought via the studio's own online store, but Rule the Waves 3 is accessible via Steam, so that makes it slightly easier to purchase. So let's find out what exactly you get for the game. Now, straight up, if you have not heard of Rule the Waves series before, graphics is not this game's strong suit. The strong suit is in simulation, detail, and the ability to customize almost everything. So we're going to essentially walk through some of the early stages of a game, maybe a couple of games, and I'll narrate what's going on and explain some of the features. So this is your splash screen, your loading screen, and as you can see, you've got the usual options that you get with most games, and as the artwork will tell you, you can start off back in the pre-dreadnought period and you can end up in the missile period. So if we go and select new game, we're offered 4 options of starting points for our new game. So we have 1890, start of the pre-dreadnought period, 1900, which will get you to the end of the pre-dreadnought period, and dreadnoughts will start coming online pretty quickly. 1920, which is obviously well into the dreadnought period, and you now have a choice of playing with or without a naval treaty in place, and that can be a historic one or a custom one, or none at all, if you want to examine what might have happened without the Washington Naval Treaty. And then, of course, 1935, when the London Naval Treaty system collapses and you're heading towards World War II and beyond. So if you select a game starting in 1900, say, this is the initial screen that you get. This shows you the different nations that you can play as. You can see we've got the United Kingdom, the British Empire, obviously, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, and the Russians, all on this lovely little map of Europe. And you also have elsewhere in the world the Japanese, the Americans, and the Chinese. And don't worry, your game aims are not necessarily to conquer the entire planet, so if you're the Austro-Hungarians, you don't need to form the greater Austro-Hungarian co-prosperity sphere of the entire planet formerly known as Earth. You can if you want, I guess, but you can play a much more local campaign. Nonetheless, this is where the first bits of detail come in. So we've selected Great Britain, as you can see here, and what the sidebar will tell you is what particular features you get if you wish to start a game with this nation. Now, as you can see here, apparently Great Britain in 1900 has opponent nations of everyone. Presumably, if you select Austria-Hungary, you will at least have the Germans on side. And you can see you've got a naval budget, you are a global naval power, you're ahead in technology, you've got a very efficient shipbuilding industry. There are some hidden flaws, though, in your ship design. Your dock size is 16,000. That's 16,000 tons, being the largest ship that you can build, unless you choose to expand your dockyards. And you have a number of advantages, both in research, which we'll come to in a bit, and additional technology. So you can see we've got ship design, radar, and electronics, all forward main armament, a particular favourite of mine, a flight deck, because of course Britain was one of the early pioneers of the aircraft carrier, and later on improved guidance systems, that's for missiles and so forth. And it'll continue down, it tells you what calibers of naval guns you've got unlocked and everything at the start. So it's a relatively easy, relatively well-known navy, so we'll select this to continue. And here's your next stage of game customization. So you can have a fleet size that ranges from very small all the way up to, numerically at least, pretty much what actually existed at the time. Now, bear in mind that the larger and larger you go, especially for a larger navy like the Royal Navy, that is going to be one very large management job, because you are going to be dealing with hundreds upon hundreds of individual ships. Whereas, obviously, a smaller navy proportionally scales everybody down, so you have fewer ships, but it might be easier to manage. You've also got a tick box for historical resources, so that'll tie you into what the actual budgets for the various navies were at the time. You can change your research rate, how wide the technological progression will vary compared to historically. And as you can see, you've got a box for inflicting harsher peace deals on your opponents, or then potentially inflicting harsher peace deals on you if you lose a war. You can give the AI an advantage if you feel it's not strong enough. You can slow down aircraft development, which is quite popular amongst quite a number of people, and you can change, obviously, the maximum airbase size, and you've lastly got an option of manual build of legacy fleet. So if you want to start out the game with a particular set of designs, you can do that as well. Once you've selected your options, it will generate your initial fleets, and we get our first view of the main game screen. You can see on the right there the varying levels of tension that exist with the different empires at the time. And yes, you will get vaguely custom fleets every time. Unless, of course, you go with a completely historical fleet, but this is the default. So here's the main menu, and this is where most of your management will come about. At the top, you can see you've got various tabs. You've got the map, to be honest, which is my default position for viewing. Our current tab, which is the ships we have in service, you can see listed. You've got battleships, armoured cruisers, light cruisers, it keeps going down, and where they are, what condition they're in, etc. What ships you've got under construction, any submarines you own, the state of your coastal fortifications, how many ships you've lost or scrapped. If you're in specific theatres, because as you'll see in a moment, the map is divided up into sort of, Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, etc., what the overview of that area is. If you have a base, what that overview is. And a new feature for Rule the Waves 3, there's also specific officers which you can have on ships or in fleets, which will give you certain advantages or possibly disadvantages. And then down there at the bottom, we've got prestige, how terrifying your nation is. You can see I'm 3,400 tons short of what I need to have deployed on foreign stations, so I will need to move a cruiser or something pretty quickly. My dock size is 16,000 tons, but I've got an option there to build more, and various other things. So there's a build requirement. The government isn't requiring me to build any ships of any particular type at the moment. There's no treaties going on at the moment. And then there's all the budgetary breakdown. And as you can see, I'm a little bit in the positive. So I'm not exceeding my budget, and I have a little bit of funds at the bottom to fall back on. And then further on the right, you've got all these other fun things, designing ships, building ships, etc., etc. And you can check out some of the designs that you already have just by right-clicking on it and viewing the ship data. So you can see here they have decided that this is a Howe-class pre-dreadnought. It has 4 12-inch guns. Compared to most British pre-dreadnoughts at the time, it's slightly overgunned. A more American-style secondary battery, and a slightly thin belt, although not entirely ahistoric for some British designs. And we've got some fire control and a central rangefinder on just over 14,000 tons, and we're a little bit quick at 19 knots. We can also go into the rebuild screen, so this is a slightly more detailed look at the ship, showing you where all the various bits of armour are, where the guns are, how many of them there are, etc. And as you can see here, we can slightly modify the design. In this case, at the moment, my proposed modifications, you can see at the bottom centre, are putting me into the red. I've made it slightly too heavy by increasing various bits and pieces. But it also shows you where every single bit of weight is calculated from, which is quite handy, so you can get into some very detailed ship design in this menu if you want. Now heading over to some other basic stuff you might want to set up once you've started a game, because of course the game is static until you choose a new turn, so you can spend as long as you like customizing your navy. At this stage we have our doctrine and training. So you can see we've got night fighting ticked, that's quite important. You can also train for improved gunnery, torpedo warfare, better damage control. There's various further options you can see with regards to torpedoes and other things, which are currently locked because you haven't developed that technology yet. And then you also have this rather nice grid at the top right of what kind of shells your ships will use when they're targeting various enemy ships. And you've currently got the battleship, battlecruiser menu open, but you've also got one for your heavy cruisers or armored cruisers and your light cruisers, and your ammunition loadouts and all this kind of thing. So you can customize most of this quite easily. The one on the top left, your training priorities, those will cost you money, as you can see. Ticking the night fighting or gunnery boxes adds an additional monthly cost to keep that training going, which will make your navy more effective, but of course leaves you with less money to do other things. So you might want to just have your navy ready to go at all times. But bearing in mind some of these things will take a few months to kick in, you might want to maybe not have them and have the money to build more ships. And then if you see the tension ramping up with a particular nation and you think, right, we are going to war with that nation, you might want to start implementing some training programs to give you a bit of an upper hand, because if you implement them once war has been declared, one or two might kick in relatively quickly, but others you might be left fighting a war for several months, possibly a year or so, without the full benefit of that particular advantage. And then of course you have your research screen. Now this shows you all the various types of technology that are under development. So on the left you've got the general type, on the middle you've got the specific technology that was last researched, and then on the right you've got what priority that research is currently under with your current assignments and what overall level it's reached. And then at the bottom you can also see how much of your budget in terms of a percentage is being dedicated to research. So you can starve that for more money for ships, or you can increase it. You obviously have less money for ships and other things, but you might have more advanced ships. So you can see here some changes I've made. I've put nothing in low, but I've prioritized a few bits and pieces, which I think will give me more of an advantage as things go on. And things like machinery development, hull form, etc., these aren't just, we have a bigger hull, we have better engines, etc. They also refine your existing engines and hull and gun turrets, etc., etc. So the guns might, in a given caliber, might become more efficient and might develop newer models of them, and also the overall weight that's required for various technologies will reduce slightly. So when you come to refit a ship, you might find that thanks to advances in machinery and armor that you've made, you can have the same machinery and the same power plant, but it now weighs less. So for the cost of a refit, you can free up displacement to use on other things, like improving your power plant or thickening your armor or putting more guns on or something. And that brings us over to the Almanac. And this shows you, to the best of your agent's knowledge, what the fleet breakdown of each nation is. So you've got your own nation on the left. In this case, obviously, we've chosen Great Britain, so it's on the left. And you can see exactly how many of each type of ship is in service, how many are building, and the total tonnage. But what those individual ships' capabilities are, you may or may not know. And depending on the amount of intelligence effort you put in, you might find information about exactly what these ships can do before you meet them in combat. And you can just see there poking out on the right hand side, you can dial up and down the amount of intel effort you put against specific nations. So we switch over to the map view, which by default is centered on your home area, in this case Great Britain. We've got our various ships on various foreign stations all mentioned there on the left, and we can take our first turn, and each turn will generate some random events. And for these random events, we have various ways of responding. So in this case, an Austro-Hungarian ship has shown up, and we're supposed to make some comment, and you can see that if we take the first option, then that's going to improve relations with Austria-Hungary, but potentially might have some negative ramifications if people think that our own ships are not as good. Then you can see we have the maximum paragon, if you like, option, just saying, yeah, hi, we're being really friendly with them, this is all great. Or we could insult them greatly, which would increase tension, which might increase our budget, but also increase the chance of war. And the second event, well, it's a little bit early, but there's been a political murder in the Balkans. So it's Tuesday? How are we going to handle this? Well, we can increase tension but also prestige by appearing very strong and demanding that everything happen. We must bring them to justice even in the event of war. We can take the middle option. There must be a diplomatic solution. That'll lower tension, but also maybe lower our prestige because we're seen as willing to submit to the will of others. And then again, you've got the renegade option at the bottom there. Whoever's political figure just got shot is probably not going to appreciate that. So, if you want to provoke a war really quickly, you can. And over the Balkans of all things. Very historical. And then we get a full summary of everything that's happened at the end of our turn. So you can see Germany's built a bunch of destroyers they had under construction already, as have a bunch of other people. We got reports that a couple of our naval officers are up and coming. They've got above average ability. Okay, fair enough. Commander Buchanan has average ability. Tension has gone up generally. Apparently, we are far too terrifying for so many people, except for Japan and Spain, who apparently are completely fine with this. And you can see we're not going to get a research breakthrough on face-hardened armor just yet, but they're working on it. So now that first turn is over, I'm going to try and design a ship. Now you can start from scratch and specify absolutely everything from the ground up. But that takes quite a while, although it is obviously completely to your liking, but that includes placing all the graphics. So what I tend to like to do in this case is auto-generate design. And you can see here the little computer button, basically top center, just to the left of the red tick button. That will auto-generate a ship for you. And you can just keep hitting auto-generate until you come up with something that's vaguely to your satisfaction, and then modify it. Now, as you can see in this case, I have slightly modified the design. It started off as a 15,900 ton design. I did pay during the first turn to expand my shipbuilding capability from 16,000 tons to 17,000 tons. So I've now put the displacement up to 16,800 tons, and the useful thing is, as you can see, the hull size has increased, but the game has also scaled the weights of everything proportionally. So just because you've increased the hull size in this case by 900 tons, that doesn't mean you now have magically 900 tons of spare displacement, because the hull's bigger, it weighs more, etc., etc. So I've made a few relatively small changes. I've increased the belt armor from 10.5 inches to 12 inches, reduced the extended and upper belts by an inch from 4 down to 3, but increased the deck from 2 inches to 3 inches, and taken the conning tower down to 4 inches, so it's basically a secondary battery proof. Everything else is roughly the same, except for the fact I've tried to also go over to oil and turbine propulsion as opposed to coal and vertical triple expansion. I've left the guns and everything the same at this stage, and you can see just how much weight that has put on with the deck armor, because on the previous screen, a 2-inch thick deck weighed 1,486 tons, and now it's 2,182 tons. That increase in deck has cost a lot more than the increase in belt armor. Even though the increase in belt armor is 1.5 inches as opposed to 1 inch, that's only increased from 2,732 to 3,053, so just under 300 tons as opposed to well over 600 tons. And thanks to the reductions, I've actually reduced the overall weight percentage of my armor by 2%. But But it turns out I haven't actually developed oil and turbine propulsion just yet, so I can't do that design. I'd have to go back and put it back to coal or vertical triple expansion, which is a little bit of a shame, but, you know, it's a pretty realistic ship design simulator, all told. We then progress through 1900, and you can see I can now build larger destroyers. A new light cruiser has come up, and I have a new research breakthrough in my turret and gun mountings. My ship design means I can have a heavier secondary battery if I want. I've got better torpedoes, and you can see the tension ramping up because I blamed France for a few things that I was responsible for. But despite that, tension with France dies down, and as it turns out, there's some problems in Norway. Germany sends an amphibious force. You can see in the map just at the top there, Norway is currently an unaligned power. And, well, in the interest of demonstrating the game, I decided that, well, if, as the intel report says, Germany may be attempting more reaching plans, and I decided to basically confront Germany and go, no, back off, my Norway. Even though historically Norway has never been part of Great Britain, but hey, it's something you can do. And that promptly launched the Great Anglo-German War of 1901. So with war declared, I get a big infusion of budget, because of course wartime budgets and all that, and need to assign some ships to trade protection if I don't want my merchant fleet to be ravaged. And so begins a small naval clash. You can see the total forces in the North Sea arrayed there at the bottom, but this is just going to be a light forces event. And here's the battle screen. So in this particular fight, I have 1 light cruiser and 3 destroyers, and my mission is to sink at least 2 enemy merchant ships. Now that will be important a bit later on. As you can see at the start of the engagement, or near the start, there is an unidentified ship ahead. The square above the cruiser means that this is a cruiser I directly control. You can see at the bottom left my controls for speed and changing direction and so forth. And the little triangular flag means that this destroyer flotilla is under AI control, but I can go into that and tell it what to do. Do I want it to act independently? Do I want to act as a core force supporting my cruiser? Do I want to act as a screen? And it will comply with what I tell it to do. But as it turns out, that unidentified ship wasn't a merchant vessel. It was in fact a German Thetis-class light cruiser, leading its own little contingent of 3 destroyers. So of course, I decided to chase them down. Now on a larger tactical scale, obviously you get the kind of graphics that you saw earlier, but since it is turn by turn, or you can play it through by a set amount of turns, or play it through by however many individual turns until something dramatic happens, depending on what you select up at the top there, you can of course therefore pause the action at any point and zoom in and see what's going on. So this is the Calliope, my lead cruiser, and you'll actually see the guns swiveling and rotating and pointing as necessary. As the battle continues, I managed to cut out the German cruiser from its destroyers, and you can see the destroyers are now bracketed by my own destroyers and by the Calliope. Of course, this being a protected cruiser of the pre-World War I period, she's got more guns on the wings than she has fore and aft, so she's actually able to engage the Thetis-class cruiser at the same time. The fighting goes on for a bit, but unfortunately for me, the Calliope was hit by a torpedo, so at any point, again, if you pause, you can go into a far more detailed screen. You can see how much ammunition you've got left, what the status of the guns are, whether they've been knocked out, permanently disabled, still operational, how many torpedoes you've got left if you have torpedoes mounted, and you can see there's both structural damage, a little bit of structural damage from gunfire, but a fair bit of flotation damage. This is where your torpedo defense and damage control comes in. So the Calliope's not in a particularly brilliant state, but she's still afloat. And with a leaky cruiser and having sunk at least one of the German destroyers, I decided discretion was the better part of valor, because if you keep maneuvering at high speed, you will increase your flooding considerably. So we set course west for the British coast, and as you can see, one of the German destroyers is sunk, the other 2 are badly damaged, they're trailing. The German cruiser decided to follow us for a little bit, but night fell. A quick torpedo salvo from the destroyer flotilla sent it scurrying back to the other destroyers, and that was pretty much the end of the battle. However, this ended up being actually a slight minor victory for the Germans, because although I came out of it tactically slightly better, the Germans lost a destroyer, 2 more heavily damaged, with a lightly damaged cruiser. I had a fair enough Calliope heavily damaged, but my 3 destroyers were mostly okay, so all of my ships will recover, even if Calliope is going to spend a bit of time in the dockyard. The Germans are basically out 1 small destroyer formation, because those destroyers will take a while in the dockyard as well, and one of them's not coming back. But, as you can see at the bottom, the Germans got points as well because I failed to sink 2 merchant vessels. They got 1 bonus surviving merchant vessel, and that meant that it was actually a minor victory to them because I'd not fulfilled the mission. So perhaps I would have been better off, once I realised that the German formation was a military one, just disengaging and heading off to find merchant ships. But there you go. The next action, however, promised to be a bit more interesting. This is a full battle. And in this engagement, I have 2 battle squadrons of pre-dreadnought battleships, 2 nice big lines of destroyers, because I've been building plenty of those, and a trio of armoured cruisers leading the fleet screen. So once again, you can see I've got 3 squadrons to directly control my heavy cruisers and my 2 units of battleships, and the destroyers at the moment are screening them. So the battle has not yet started. It doesn't launch you straight into the battle, but where it positions your ships, the enemy fleet will be somewhere in the vicinity if you choose the right direction. So there's me telling my heavy cruisers, or armoured cruisers I suppose, to head off towards German-held territory, and my battleships likewise are also going to be heading east or vaguely southeast. The destroyers will align themselves accordingly. I'm giving a few orders to the destroyer flotillas so they know what to do, but as you can see, we've spotted some unknown enemy ships over to the east, and so we're going to head over and see what we can see in terms of an engagement. And this is where the play through till something dramatic happens option is quite useful, because you can set up your movement, and instead of having to play it through in a single turn or maybe 5 or 6 turns, you can just get it to run, and then, as you can see, it's pausing as the enemy fleet comes into view. Now, unlike the previous engagement, this one, once it was all done, actually came off much, much better for me. As you can see, we started out with, actually, theoretically, the Germans having the advantage. They had considerably more destroyers. They had 5 light cruisers. We were equal in armoured cruisers, and they had an additional battleship. However, unfortunately, the recording that I tried to do of the battle itself failed, but essentially what I did was a slightly grander version of what I did with the light cruiser clash, which was use my armoured cruisers to sever a portion of the enemy fleet screen, i.e. the non-battleships, from the main formation. All of my armoured cruisers carry torpedo tubes, which helps. And into this gap, I put my destroyers with lots of torpedoes, which further opened the breach. And I was then able to use the superior firepower of my armoured cruisers and my slightly more modern destroyers against the German light forces, which were slightly older, whilst my battleships and their battleships kind of held off against each other, and my secondaries got engaged with the German light forces. The sheer number of torpedoes and the size of my destroyers, I think, was actually to my advantage. I actually had more torpedo launchers in the fleet than the Germans did, despite them having the greater numbers, and you can see that reflected in the overall results. Although I lost 2 destroyers and had 1 heavily damaged, the Germans lost 3 destroyers with 2 heavily damaged, and then you'll notice that none of my other ships suffered anything more than light damage to 2 of my battleships and 1 of my armoured cruisers, whilst the Germans suffered medium damage to a battleship and an armoured cruiser, light damage to 2 battleships and an armoured cruiser, and light damage to 5 of their destroyers. So it wasn't the world's most decisive clash, but considering that I was actually outnumbered in this particular scenario, I ended up taking 1 more of the enemy's destroyers down than they took down of mine, and they had more damage overall, which resulted in, as you can see, I got many more points for inflicting damage on the enemy vessels, so it was overall a pretty good victory for myself. So I saved that game, I'll come back to it later. There are a few other minor battles and so forth in the ongoing war with Germany, but let's skip forward to the 1920s. So this is the start menu for the 1920s. As you can see, the nations have switched around a little bit. You've got a German Republic instead of a German Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is no more. Russia has turned into the USSR, and the Chinese have changed their alignment as well. You can also see that we have a somewhat improved dock size. We can build much larger ships. The overall stats have changed somewhat for Britain, reflecting her status in 1920. And if you launch into 1920, you're also party to negotiations on what was historically the Washington Naval Treaty. So you can see the standard restrictions that are put in place for the one of the conditions, 10,000 tons, 8-inch guns. That's for cruisers, and what you'll be allowed to build as a maximum for the next 10 years, because of course it's a battleship building holiday. And you can just say, okay, yeah, we're going to accept the limits as they were historically, or as you can see, you can either try and negotiate for more displacement and a higher caliber of guns, or a lower caliber and displacement limit, if you like. And after some back and forths over various terms and conditions at the different levels, you can see this was the final iteration, which I decided to accept. So still 10,000 tons for the cruisers, but we've now got a 10-inch caliber limit. That's not necessarily what I wanted. I was actually hoping to get more displacement and still keep 8-inch guns, but never mind. We also, as you can see, have a slightly higher displacement total tonnage than the USA, which has 590,000. We have 650,000 tons, and half of that can be capital ships and aircraft carriers. And in this version of the treaty, France is on a par with Japan at the second tier, Italy's on a third tier, and then the Soviet Union, Germany, China, and Spain are all on the very lowest of tiers. And we decided to accept this terms. So looking at the fleet that's been auto-generated for me, that's a pretty good approximation of Dreadnought. You can see one of my older ships. And then going through and sorting, I've got a battle cruiser. What's the game come up with as my battle cruiser? Well, 8 13-inch guns. That's Lion-type layout. This supposed Hood-class battleship's kind of like a Queen Elizabeth, but slightly less well protected. And then we can look at some of the heavy cruisers. So this Cressy class is essentially a scaled down but slightly better protected Invincible, so 10-inch guns, but slightly more on the belt armour. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to design a battleship. So I put the displacement up to the maximum, 40,000 tons, and went auto design. And no, I don't like that one. Q turret, not my flavour, so I thought, let's tell it to redesign again. You can see the basic layout that it's generated, but nonetheless, this is more what I want, all forward design, Nelson style. Now this one is slightly under the tonnage, or more the maximum tonnage that I can build, so I thought, let's see how close I can get to Nelson in 1920. So putting up to 40,000 tons, 25 knots. You can see I'm slightly overweight, need to make a little bit of a saving somewhere, but I'm going to put an inclined belt with a 14-inch armour. So I'm trying to basically see what I can get out of the designer with my ideal layout first, and then see what I have to trim. So I've got 5.5-inch thick deck, minimize the conning tower. Turrets are okay. You can see I'm about 500 tons over. My triple turrets are 15-inch. I've got some broadside torpedoes, so I can delete the torpedo tubes. That might save a little bit of weight. Not too much, as it turns out, so I decided I'm going to go and try and find other stuff to save weight on. So I've got my secondaries. At the moment I have 14 secondary guns in twin 6-inch turrets, and I have some 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, a half dozen of them. So where can I save weight? I've only got to save about 400, just over 400 tons, so it should be doable. So first things first, let's reduce down the number of secondaries and taking it down to 8. Still not quite. Okay, fair enough. I might as well have my 14 and realign them. I've actually gone up to 16, so I have a nice even number. Lots of secondaries. That's quite good. Okay, so if I shave off the belt armor down to say 13 inches inclined, still not quite enough. What if I take down the speed? So my machinery plant needs to be less. 24 knots. I've got underweight, so I can put my belt back up to 14 inches, and I'm just a touch underneath the weight limit. So, pretty much a fractionally faster version of Nelson with a bigger secondary battery. I don't yet have the technology for secondary turrets, but I'm happy to research that, and I've saved the design. And I can also build aircraft carriers. So you can see I've got all sorts of additional options compared to when I'd started in 1900. So let's see, 20,000 ton aircraft carrier. Again, I will be able to design it. Won't be able to necessarily build it, but auto design has given me this 12,200 ton carrier, which looks pretty nifty. and as you can see, can hold 30 aircraft. A fair number of secondary guns. Alternatively, I can have this 8,200 ton lighter carrier, which again is quite heavily armed, but never mind. It's got actually a very 1920s design. You see the little bow sticking out there with some deck guns. This has 26 aircraft. I'm not too enamored of that. I want a slightly larger carrier. Oh look, it's sort of an early Furious or Courageous Glorious type design, but still not the world's biggest aircraft capacity. That's gone up to 12,200. Here's another option, 14,600. My air group's gone up a little bit more as well, so I'm quite happy with that. But it gives me some idea of what I could build somewhat later on. So let's go and have a look at my armoured cruiser. So this is effectively a heavy cruiser, but under treaty limits. So this is a slightly odd one with, again, a Q turret and 9-inch guns. Not particularly well protected, but pretty darn quick, 31 knots. You can see you've got rounds per gun, what kind of fire control I've got, how many fire control positions I have. Yeah, this is not a particularly well-protected vessel. I mean, it's kind of like a slightly overgunned Pensacola, and remember the treaty now has 10-inch guns for my treaty cruisers, so the 9-inch gun is entirely possible. And then after playing through for a couple of in-game years, I managed to provoke a war with France, and Rule the Waves 3 is much better about situating yourself in large fleet battles, which is playing through at high speed in the background, because otherwise this is a half-hour bit of footage. And in Rule the Waves 1 and 2, you could have very large fleets, but it was very rare the game would actually generate fleet battles. You get a lot of little skirmishes. Rule the Waves 3 is much better about generating fleet battles if you have large fleets present in a particular theatre, and as you can see, I'm leading a good chunk of my navy in a night action with the French. You can see there's the Terminator line, and as the Terminator line pops up, suddenly it turns out there's a lot of French ships. I'm again trying to directly control who is being targeting what and where they're going for the units with the squares flags, and the diamond or triangle flags are just following. There you can see I've lost some turrets on one of my battle cruisers, and this is all taking place out to the west of the Bay of Biscay. The main French fleet is up there, and honestly, this takes quite a bit to work out how to control. You can see all the data being processed there, hits and misses, and who's shooting at who. The French, to be fair, at this stage have a bit more of a coherent formation, and I had forgotten to change the orders of my destroyers, so you can see all my destroyers, for the most part, are hanging back there, still trying to act as core units rather than as torpedoing flotillas in the fleet screen, which they should be. I only remember that a little bit later on in this fight. But as you watch that progress, I think you've got a pretty good idea of what Rule the Waves 3 is like. Admittedly, you've only seen the start of a couple of campaigns. If you want to go further back, start in 1890, you can get the proper old school pre-dreadnoughts, and of course you can start in 1935 and launch yourself straight into the Second World War, if you like, which is also fun. Obviously, that carries forward with much more aircraft involvement. This battle will eventually have some aircraft show up, and missiles eventually. If you play through from 1890, if you play through for long enough, you will eventually reach the missile age. Obviously 1935 gives you a bit of a head up on that if you want to actually just go through and start shooting missiles and flying aircraft at each other a lot more, but yeah, why would you want to do that? So yeah, I think Rule the Waves 3 is actually a pretty good ship designer, a fairly surprisingly realistic politics simulator, and given that you're trying to control some governmental actions and the entire design, build, and action policy of an entire navy as one person, obviously there is a lot of information, very densely packed as you've seen already, but it is processable once you understand what all these things are doing. So you can see here I'm designating specific targets for my various fleet elements, which have gotten a little bit scattered. But you can see in them with the pause, you can change who they're screening, where they're going. And to be honest, with most of this battle being a night action, people popping in and out of visibility, formations going all over the place, you can see some of my ships down there not doing particularly well. I after a certain point, I had no idea what was really going on, other than some of my ships are still operational, so kind of gather round as ships began to drop off. This is around about the point I realised my destroyers really weren't pulling their weight, so I pulled back my surviving capital units and got my destroyers to get in on the action as well. I would definitely recommend Rule the Waves 3 if you like basically being in charge of your own navy and you like lots of little alternate history scenarios. Obviously, the way the ships maneuver and everything is reasonably accurate, even if this complete mess is, well, it's not necessarily entirely inaccurate when you look at the Jutland night action, but a lot of this, as I said, is kind of on me for not ordering my fleet into the correct formations and being hyper aggressive in the face of the French fleet and its torpedoes, which will cost me a little bit as time goes on. There's me at various points checking out how my ships are doing. But if you'd like to pick it up, a link should be in the description. Otherwise, just go to Steam and put in Rule the Waves 3. Thank you very much to the developers for sending me this copy. I have advanced this game and the other one considerably since this recording was completed. But I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed Rule the Waves 1 and Rule the Waves 2 as well. And the amount of functionality in there, like being able to slow down aircraft if you don't really want to be fighting mass carrier battles and so forth, is quite impressive. As I mentioned at the beginning, it is basically a high detail, low graphics game. The graphics are perfectly clear and understandable, but you're not talking fancy 3D models. And to be honest, if you've ever played some of the larger 3D model based combat games that do a lot of the accurate simulation like this, a battle like this would be taxing most computers with any high degree of fidelity. So given that this isn't even the largest fleet battle I've fought in Rule the Waves 3, the fact that this runs like a dream, very nice and smooth, is quite useful. As you can see, I'm kind of consolidating the surviving elements of my fleet at this stage. We are moving towards the end of what was a somewhat speeded up half-hour engagement that I've compressed down to under 5 minutes. And the battles generally will end when you are no longer in contact with the enemy. So they will have a specific amount of time that they're supposed to run, but if it gets to the end of that time and the enemy's not in contact, or it gets close to that time and there's no chance of you getting back in contact with the enemy, it'll say, right, you're not in contact, do you want to end the game now? But if you run up to the time limit, or the suggested time limit that is, and you're still in contact, it will play the battle out until the battle ends. Either one side or the other is completely sunk, or you've managed to break off and figure out a way to escape the situation, or maybe the enemies run away. Nightfall is usually quite good for that, and as you can see, my very large fleet has been consolidated down to a much smaller set of vessels with others scattered around, and there's the Terminator line going across, because that battle actually took all day. Not all day literally, but all day in game. And as you can see, I actually managed to come out the winner. I lost 2 battle cruisers and 2 battleships, with another battle cruiser heavily damaged, a few destroyers and 1 heavy cruiser, but the French lost 2 battle cruisers as well, but they lost 4 battleships and another heavily damaged, plus 2 light cruisers and 6 destroyers, a bunch of stuff damaged, and their main mission was to protect a merchant ship convoy, and I managed to sink 17 out of the 18 merchant ships. So yeah, they lost this battle by quite a large margin. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Rule the Waves 3. Hope you've enjoyed this slightly different Fun Friday. We're looking at a game that I quite enjoy, and I hope some of you will too. Have fun with it.